Hello and welcome, ladies and gents, boys and girls, story lovers all over the world, to another episode of Never Lost, where we retell and talk about the old Scots folk tales and fairy stories so that they will never be forgotten. Today, I'm going to talk a little about the story that I told in the last episode, Peerifool, and also recount a few similar tales. Peerifool is a fascinating story for a number of reasons. For one thing, it's really an amalgamation or a mishmash of more than one type of story. The most obvious, and the one which gives the story its title, Peerifool, is very similar to Rumpelstiltskin. The Arne Thompson Uther Index lists this sort of story as type 500, I think, the name of the supernatural helper. And there are many variations on this style of story, and they usually play out in roughly the same way. Someone has an impossible task to complete, and they are offered help by some sort of magical creature, such as fairies or imps. The magical helper is always vague regarding the payment for the service, and the person is always desperate enough to agree to any payment before the task is even started. Once complete, the payment tends to be something ridiculous, such as the person's firstborn son. Then, there's always a caveat that if the person can guess the magic helper's true name, then the debt is cancelled. The protagonist will then discover the name somehow, and when they guess it, the magical helper is honour bound to leave forever, or sometimes they kill themselves in sheer rage, like in Rumpelstiltskin. We see this plot repeat itself in most versions of the story type. In the Cornish folktale Duffy and the Devil, where the devil's name is Terrytop, in the Slovakian story The Golden Spinster, and in the Scottish folktale of Whuppity Stoorie, which I will briefly retell in a moment. But it also plays out in the final princess's dealings with the fairies in the story of Peerifool, where the princess must guess the name of the fairy or else lose the cloth which she had to spin for the giant. However, here it's more of a small story within the story. Anyway, without further ado, let's sit back and start the story of Whuppity Stoorie. A lang, lang time ago, when there were fairies and brownies and kelpies and selkies, and magic still lived in the forests and moors of Scotland's bens and glens, there was a good wife in the borders village of Kittler Rumpet. It came to be that the good wife fell on terrible hard times. Not long after the birth of her first son, her husband went to market one day and never returned. Some said he had been got by bandits. Some said he had been taken to sea by the press gangs. So she was left to feed and clothe her bonny wee bairn and herself. All the village pitied the good wife's plight, but none helped her. She had naught left but her house, her prize sow, and her baby boy. Her one hope was that the sow would soon give birth to piglets, and if all went well, her stock would be much increased. But it was not to be. For one morning, when she went to the pigsty, she found the sow lying on her back, groaning and grunting like she was at death's door. This was a sore blow to the good wife's heart, and she sat down on the knocking stone and cried harder than she ever had over the loss of her husband. Why she was more sorry about the pig than her husband, who knows? But as she sat wiping her eyes, she chanced to look down the brae, and what she saw was a little old woman making her way up the hill towards the house. She was dressed all in green, save for the short white apron tied about her waist, and a black velvet hood, and a steeple-crowned beaver hat which she wore on her head. She walked with a long walking stick, as tall as she was, to help her on her way. Seeing the gentlewoman draw near, the good wife rose and made a curtsy. Weeping, she said, "Madam, I am the most unfortunate woman alive." The old woman said, "I dinna wish to hear pipers' news and fiddlers' tales. I ken you've lost your good man, and I ken that your sow's sick. Noo, what will ye gie me to cure her?" "Onything your ladyship's madam likes," said the goodwife, unaware of whom she was dealing with. "Let's wet Thumb on the bargain," said the green woman. And so thumbs were wet, and the green woman marched into the pigsty. She glowered at the sow for some time, then began to chant, so as the goodwife could barely hear. "Pitter patter, holy water, pitter patter, holy water." Then from her pocket she drew a small bottle with something oily inside it, and she sprinkled it around the pig's snout and behind her ears and on the tip of her tail. Then suddenly she said, "Get up, beast!" And no sooner had she said that than the sow leapt to its feet, and quite the thing was away to its breakfast trough. The good wife of Kilter Rumpet was overcome with joy, and would have kissed the hem of the green woman's dress if she'd let her. "I'm no fond o' such demonstrations," said the old woman. "Now that I have righted your sick beast, let's finish your bargain. You'll no find me an unreasonable greedy body. I like aye to do a good turn for a small reward. All I ask and will have is that laddie bairn of yours." The goodwife let out a gasp, for now she could see what she hadn't before. The green woman was a fairy, one of the Downie Stories. Falling to her knees, she wept and prayed and begged, but the fairy would not relent. "Ye may spare your din," she said, "skirling as if I was deaf as a doornail, but this I'll tell ye, by the law of the fairies, I canna take your bairn till the 3rd day after this, and not even then if ye can tell me my true name." And off she went, away round the pigsty and back down the brae, leaving the goodwife to her misery. For a night and a day the goodwife could do naught but cry and hold her babe to her chest. On the 2nd day, at a loss for what to do, she went walking in the woods, babe in her arms. She walked deep into the forest, to where an old quarry lay, grown over with gorse, and home to a spring well. As she approached, she caught the sound of a lint wheel turning, and a soft voice singing. The goodwife crept closer, and peered through the bushes into the quarry below. There, at the bottom, was the green fairy, working away at a wheel and singing. "Little kens our good dame at hame, that Whuppity Stoorie is my name." And then the goodwife's heart was light once more, for she had the magic words. She knew the fairy's true name. She walked home with a spring in her step, gleeful at the thought of tricking the old fairy. Feeling much like her old self again, the goodwife thought to have some fun with the fairy lady. On the 3rd day at the appointed time, she put her baby behind the knocking stone, then sat down on it herself, a look of great woe on her face. Before long the green fairy appeared over the hill, and called out, "Goodwife o' Kilter Rumpet, ye ken weel what I come for. Stand and deliver." The goodwife pretended to weep even harder than before, and fell onto her knees, crying, "Och, sweet madam mistress, spare my only bairn, and take the weary Sue instead." But the fairy said, "I come nae here for swine's flesh. Dinna be stubborn, but gie me the bairn." "Och no, dearie lady mine," wept the poor goodwife, "forbear my poor wean, and take myself in its stead." The fairy's expression soured. "She's clean demented. Wha in all the earthly world, wi' half an ee in their heads, would ever want with the likes o' thee?" This raised the goodwife's hackles, for though her eyes were wet and her nose was red from crying, she considered herself still quite comely. Up she leapt, and set her nightcap straight, and making a low curtsy, she said, "In troth, fair maiden, I might hae had the wit to ken that the likes o' me is nae fair to tie the worst shoestrings o' the high and mighty Whuppity Stoorie." At that, Whuppity Stoorie nearly jumped out of her skin. Then turning on her heel, she ran down the hill, screeching her rage for all of Kilterumpet to hear. The good wife of Kilterumpet laughed until her sides ached, and then picked up her babe and went into her house, singing all the way. And that is the end of the story of Whuppity Stoorie. We can clearly see the similarities with parts of the Peerifool story. A fairy helper performs an impossible task, and then the protagonist has to guess their name. However, this is only one small part of the Peerifool story. It's more of an insert into another story, which is the abduction of 3 princesses by a giant and their rescue by the third and most competent princess. This larger part of the Peerifool story, I think, comes from the adaptation of a Scandinavian folktale. I've said before that Shetland and Orkney have a slightly larger Norse influence on their culture and on their stories than the rest of Scotland. Many of the Scottish islands were ruled by Norse kings at various times during the course of recorded history, so this isn't surprising. Many of Orkney's landmarks are said to have been made by giants. For example, here's a short tale of how the lochs of Stenness and Harray were formed, and the hills on the island of Hoy. There was once a giant who lived in Caithness, and what he loved more than anything else was his garden. But the soil there was poor, and he looked over the Pentland Firth towards Orkney, and he saw how green the islands were. "Oh, if only I had some of that garden good fertile earth for my garden," he said. One day he took a straw basket, called a casey, which you wear on your back but has a strap that goes around your chest to hold it in place. And he took his staff and he waded across the sea towards Orkney. He was so huge that the water barely came up to his waist. When he found a likely spot, he set his cassie on the ground, and with one of his huge hands he scooped up a handful of soil and turf and tipped it into the cassie. Then he took his other hand and gouged out another huge handful of earth and tipped that into his cassie. Then he swung the cassie onto his back, adjusted the strap, and set off for home. Now, water flowed into the 2 huge holes that he had made, and these became the Stenness and the Harray lochs. As he carried on his journey home, a couple of small bits of earth fell from the cassie and landed in the sea. This made the inner and outer homes that you see in Stromness harbour. Then a large piece of turf slid off the top of the cassie and fell into the sea with a mighty splash, and there it remains to this day as the island of Grahamsay with its 2 lighthouses. He hadn't gone much further when disaster struck. The strap of the cassie broke and his whole load of earth and turf fell, which made the hills of Hoy. The poor old giant was so upset that he went home and never came back to Orkney again. Another story tells us how the standing stones, known as the Ring of Brodgar, were made. There were also smaller giants who lived in Orkney. Still giants, but not as huge as the one that had waded across from Caithness. Now these smaller giants loved to dance. The place that they chose for their dances was the strip of land between the 2 lochs that the Caithness giant had created. They danced and danced in great circles as a fiddler played a tune. Around and around they went, having such fun that they lost track of time, and as the sun rose, it turned them all to stone. And there they remain to this day. We now call them the Ring of Brodgar. And the comet stone that stands nearby is supposed to be the fiddle player. Anyway, why might the Norse influence on Orkney and this prevalence for stories about giants be important? Well, remember I said that Peerifool was a story inside another story. The fairy part of Peerifool is clearly a Whuppity Stoorie type of story. Well, I heard a Norse story a long time ago at a festival, which I think the rest of the Peerifool story was adapted from. It's called The Giant Who Wanted to Get Married, and I will retell it now as best I can remember. I say that because although I can find many references to the story, I can't find any record of it which isn't written in Norse, which I don't speak, so I'll be telling this briefly from the memory of hearing the story a long time ago. So without further ado, let's sit back and start the story of the giant who wanted to get married. A lang, lang time ago, somewhere in the Norse lands, there lived 3 sisters. The sisters had lost their mother and father, and they lived together in a longhouse by a small fjord. The third sister, as the youngest, was the one who did most of the work in the house, such as the cooking and the cleaning, while the 2 older sisters handled the selling of the small farm's produce at market. One day, while the younger sister was out tending to the cows, and the middle sister was off at market, a giant came striding over the fjords towards their house. Earlier that morning, before going out, the youngest sister had put a great pot of soup on to boil, and the delicious smell was filling the long house and drifting out into the cold air. The giant smelled the soup, and he came bursting into the house. The sister who was home could do nothing to stop the giant, as he greedily ate all the soup from the pot. When he was finished, the giant looked around and saw the sister cowering in a corner of the house. He thought to himself that any woman who could make a soup so delicious would be a worthy wife, and so he carried the sister off to his home inside a mountain. The giant set the first sister down in his kitchen and told her to make his supper, for he would be hungry again soon. Although she herself seldom did the cooking at home, she did her best, fearful of what the giant might do to her if she refused. That evening the giant ate the soup that the first sister had made. It was nothing like the delicious soup that he had eaten that morning, but it was also a great deal better than the raw sheep's meat that he usually ate. The giant was satisfied, if not impressed, with the first sister's cooking, and so next he asks her to be his wife and keep his house here, inside the mountain. The first sister is appalled at the idea, because the giant is, to her eyes, a lumbering and ugly creature. So she tells him that nothing on the earth could ever convince her to take such a hideous beast as her husband. Furious with the first sister's refusal, the giant kills her and hides her body in one of the rooms of his home under the mountain. The next day, the giant again goes striding across the land, and again at the longhouse the third sister has made soup before going out to tend the cows. When the giant smells it, he bursts into the house. This time, it is the second sister who is powerless to stop him. He eats all the soup and then carries her off. The second sister's fate is exactly the same as the first. She makes the giant's supper, but then refuses his proposal of marriage, and the giant kills her and puts her body in the same room as her sister. At the longhouse, the third sister is now wondering what has happened to her 2 sisters. So, the next day she makes some soup as she has before, but then she waits to see what happens. When the giant comes, she doesn't even try to stop him. In fact, she serves him the soup gladly, and then willingly goes with him to his home inside the mountain. Once there, she makes the giant his supper, and this time it is the greatest thing the giant has ever tasted, and he is very pleased with himself for finally finding the right young maiden. The giant is even more pleased when the third sister agrees happily to marry him. However, she tells the giant that the wedding can't happen for at least 7 days. During the first 5 days, she searches the giant's home inside the mountain, including a room which she was forbidden to enter, and she finds her dead sisters, who she promptly revives by rubbing them with a magic ointment. Next, the third sister tells the giant that 3 sacks of riches must be taken to the house that he took her from as a dowry for her hand in marriage. That night, the giant takes the first sack, and the next night he takes the second, not knowing that the other two sisters were hidden inside these sacks. On the final night of the 7 days before the wedding, the third sister herself hides in the third sack, after leaving a decoy made of straw in her bed to fool the giant. When the giant returns after delivering the third sack, he discovers that the third sister is missing, and he finds the decoy in her bed. He's so furiously angry at having been tricked by the third sister that he literally bursts with rage. And the three sisters live well for the rest of their days on the riches that the third sister tricked out of the giant. That's the end of the story of the giant who wanted to get married. The parallels with the story of Peerifool are obvious. Three maidens abducted by a giant who was stealing food, be it cabbages or soup. The first two are killed or beaten when they fail to appease him, and then the third effects the rescue of her sisters after reviving them and stealing the giant's wealth. Finally, we see the death of the giant, either by being crushed under a millstone, dropped on him by the sisters, like in Peerifool, or by simply exploding with anger, such as in the story we've just told. For me, it's quite clear to see how the story of Peerifool developed by inserting the Whuppity Stoorie story into the larger context of this earlier Norse tale. Okay, that about wraps up this episode of Never Lost. Please leave comments and likes if you enjoyed it, or even if you didn't. The Never Lost social media should be up by now, so join us on Facebook, where I will post updates on upcoming episodes and things. As always, thank you so much for joining me, and I very much hope to see you next story.